There's a pattern you notice once you start watching carefully. The people who hold genuine power, the ones who control outcomes, shape environments, and dictate terms, move with an almost unsettling slowness. They don't jump at opportunities. They don't respond immediately to provocations. They don't announce their intentions prematurely or scramble to prove themselves. Meanwhile, those desperately grasping for influence exhaust themselves in constant motion, signaling their availability, their eagerness, their need to be chosen. This creates a strange inversion that most people fail to recognize. Urgency is rarely a sign of ambition. More often, it's a confession of weakness. It reveals someone operating from scarcity, reacting to conditions they don't control, trying to outrun their own irrelevance. Real power moves slowly because it can afford to. It has options. It has leverage. It understands that timing is not about speed. It's about positioning. And those who rush are usually running toward subordination while believing they're chasing success. The confusion runs deep because we've been trained to worship activity. We mistake busyness for importance, reactivity for decisiveness, and constant availability for commitment. But if you study how power actually accumulates and consolidates itself, you discover something uncomfortable. The people who win are usually the ones who waited while everyone else burned themselves out competing for scraps. Consider the political calculation that defined one of the 20th century's most consequential power transfers. In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union was a pressure cooker of competing ambitions following Stalin's death. Multiple figures within the Communist Party apparatus positioned themselves for succession, each carrying different portfolios of influence and each presenting different threats to the others. Nikita Khrushchev appeared, to many observers, to be a secondary figure, crude, underestimated, not particularly ideological compared to the theorists surrounding him. His rivals moved quickly. Lavrentiy Beria, who controlled the secret police apparatus, immediately began consolidating power, issuing orders, making bold reforms, signaling his dominance. He rushed to demonstrate that he was indispensable, that he had seized the initiative, that the future belonged to him. Khrushchev watched. He built quiet alliances. He let Beria's urgency reveal the man's intentions and, more importantly, reveal the threat he posed to everyone else in the leadership circle. Beria's speed made him visible. His boldness made him dangerous to too many people simultaneously. He created enemies faster than he could neutralize them because he couldn't afford to wait or believed he couldn't. Within months, Beria was arrested and executed, removed by a coalition that Khrushchev had helped orchestrate without ever appearing to lead. Khrushchev's patience allowed him to observe how the board was actually arranged, to understand which fears motivated which players, and to position himself as the solution rather than as another threat. He moved slowly enough that when he finally moved decisively, the ground had already shifted in his favor. The rivals who rushed revealed their desperation. They showed that they were afraid of being overlooked, afraid that their window was closing, afraid that someone else would claim what they believed was theirs. Fear is always the engine of urgency, and fear, however rational it might be, signals to everyone watching that you're operating from a position of anxiety rather than abundance. This dynamic exposes something fundamental about how power relates to time. When you control resources, access, or outcomes that others need, you automatically control the tempo of interaction. You're not waiting for permission. You're not racing a clock someone else set. You're not anxious about whether the opportunity will still be there tomorrow because, in a meaningful sense, you are the opportunity. Others wait for your attention, your approval, your decision. This inverts the entire psychology of time. Urgency becomes something you impose on others, not something imposed on you. The powerful understand that most situations contain more information than is immediately visible, and that information reveals itself slowly to those who can afford to wait. Rushing forces you to decide before you know what you're really deciding between. It means operating with incomplete maps while pretending you can see the whole territory. Patient observation, by contrast, allows you to watch how people behave under pressure, to see what they're willing to sacrifice, to identify what they're actually protecting versus what they claim to value. This is intelligence that simply cannot be gathered quickly. You have to let people show you who they are, and people only show you their truth when they think they're running out of time. Delayed gratification functions as a filtering mechanism for power because it's psychologically unbearable for most people. The research on impulse control and life outcomes is almost redundant at this point. The ability to wait correlates with virtually every measure of success we can quantify. But the mechanism underneath that correlation is rarely examined. Waiting isn't virtuous. It's strategic. It allows you to avoid being cornered into suboptimal choices by artificial urgency. It prevents you from revealing your hand prematurely. It keeps you from committing to battles you don't need to fight. More importantly, the ability to wait signals something to everyone watching. You have alternatives. You have resources. You have time. These signals shape how others calculate their own positions relative to yours. When someone knows you're desperate, when they know you need this deal, this job, this alliance more than they do, they recalibrate everything. They offer less. They demand more. They test your boundaries because they understand you're negotiating from scarcity. Your urgency becomes their leverage. In business negotiations, this plays out with mechanical predictability. The party that controls the timeline controls the outcome. If you're racing toward a deadline that only you care about, an earnings call, a funding round, a contractual obligation, you've already conceded leverage before the conversation begins. Sophisticated counterparties don't need to say anything. They simply delay. They introduce new considerations. They wait for your urgency to compound into anxiety, and anxiety into concessionary behavior. The negotiation happens in the silence, in the waiting, long before anyone discusses terms. This is why experienced dealmakers build positions that don't require urgency. They maintain enough capital to walk away. They cultivate multiple options so that no single outcome is existential. They structure their operations so that delays hurt the other side more than they hurt them. They understand that patience is not a personality trait. It's a byproduct of having prepared your position well enough that you can afford to wait while others cannot. The same principle governs career advancement, though it's disguised by meritocratic rhetoric about hard work and visibility. People who rush to prove themselves, who volunteer for every project, who respond to emails at midnight, who signal constant availability, they believe they're demonstrating value. What they're actually demonstrating is anxiety about their position. They're showing that they're afraid of being forgotten, afraid of being replaceable, afraid that their contributions aren't obvious enough to speak for themselves. This creates a trap. The more frantically you signal your value, the more you train others to see you as someone who needs their validation. You become the person who can be summoned, the person who will scramble, the person who doesn't have the luxury of selectivity. Power in organizational hierarchies accrues to those who create space around themselves. They don't respond immediately because their time is structured around priorities that others don't see. They don't accept every meeting because their presence has been calibrated to mean something. When they do engage, it's not reactive. It's because they've decided that this is where their attention creates leverage. This restraint isn't arrogance. It's positioning. It forces others to operate on your timeline rather than constantly operating on theirs. It establishes that access to you is valuable, which means that access to you can be negotiated. The same mechanism governs wealth accumulation at scales that most people never consider. Generational wealth isn't built through urgency. It's built through positioning in assets that compound slowly and asymmetrically, and then waiting decades while the impatient are shaken out by volatility they can't psychologically endure. Every market panic is an intelligence test disguised as a financial event. It separates those who have structured their lives to weather storms from those who are forced to make decisions under duress. The wealthy buy during crashes not because they're contrarians by nature, but because they've built enough buffer that they can afford to act when others are forced to react. The poor and the desperate sell at bottoms because they have no choice. They rushed into positions they couldn't sustain. They over-leveraged based on optimistic projections. They assumed stability that never existed. Their urgency to participate, to not miss out, to get theirs before the opportunity disappeared. That urgency set the trap. The patient didn't need to outsmart them. They just needed to be able to wait while panic did its work. Social influence operates on identical principles, though the currency is attention rather than capital. People who rush to speak, who flood platforms with content, who react to every trend, who position themselves as always available and always performing. They're signaling dependence on the audience's approval. They need the validation loop to keep running because without it, they have no way of measuring their own relevance. This creates a treadmill they can never escape. The moment they stop producing, the moment they stop reacting, they risk being forgotten. The algorithm rewards their anxiety by training them to be more anxious. Meanwhile, those who control narratives rather than react to them operate on different time frames. They speak less frequently, which makes their words carry more weight. They don't engage with provocations, which forces others to compete for their attention. They understand that silence can be more powerful than speech when you've positioned yourself correctly. Their influence grows not through constant availability, but through strategic scarcity. They've made themselves valuable enough that people wait for them rather than the other way around. There are warning signs that broadcast rush behavior to anyone watching. Overcommitment is the most obvious, saying yes to everything because you're afraid that saying no reveals your limitations. This fragments your attention, degrades your effectiveness, and signals to everyone that you haven't learned to protect your time. Desperation seeps through in micro signals, responding too quickly to messages, being too available for meetings that others treat casually, accepting terms without negotiation, filling silence with unnecessary explanation. Each behavior is rational in isolation, but catastrophic in aggregate because they all point to the same underlying condition. You need this more than the other party does. Reactive decision-making reveals the same pathology. If your choices are determined by what just happened rather than by a strategy you're executing regardless of circumstances, you're being moved by forces outside your control. You're responding to problems others created, on timelines others set, within frameworks others established. This is the opposite of power. This is administration of someone else's agenda. Premature announcements are particularly costly. When you declare intentions before you've built the capability to execute them, you create accountability without leverage. You give rivals time to adapt. You invite scrutiny before you're ready. You turn potential advantages into public commitments that can be used against you. Powerful people move in silence and then announce results. The weak announce plans and hope that declaration will substitute for preparation. Chasing validation is perhaps the most reliable indicator of rush behavior because it reveals the entire psychological structure. If you need external confirmation that you're on the right path, you haven't built conviction in your strategy. If you need others to recognize your value, you don't trust that your results will eventually make your value undeniable. If you need approval from gatekeepers, you haven't built enough leverage to make the gate irrelevant. This need accelerates everything. It makes you rush to prove yourself, to be seen, to be chosen. And that acceleration puts you at the mercy of those who control access to what you're seeking. The strategic response isn't to artificially slow yourself down or to perform patience as a tactic. It's to build positions that genuinely don't require urgency. This starts with resource accumulation. Enough savings, enough skills, enough relationships that you have options when opportunities or threats emerge. Options are what allow patience. When you have alternatives, you can afford to wait for the right situation rather than accepting whatever situation presents itself first. Strategic waiting is intelligence gathering disguised as an action. While others rush to decide, you're watching who reveals themselves under pressure, how organizations actually function versus how they claim to function, which stated priorities are real and which are performance. You're mapping the terrain while others are charging forward based on incomplete information. By the time you move, you know things they still don't know, and that asymmetry is decisive. Information accumulation compounds slowly but exponentially. Every conversation, every observation, every document, every behavioral pattern you notice becomes a data point. Most of it seems useless initially, but over time, patterns emerge. You begin to see how certain people always respond to specific incentives. You recognize which organizations make decisions emotionally versus rationally. You identify which signals predict which outcomes. This map only develops through patient observation across many situations. It cannot be rushed. Creating options rather than urgency means structuring your life so that you always have a viable alternative to whatever is currently on the table. This applies to employment, to relationships, to investments, to every domain where power is negotiated. The person who needs the deal closes on bad terms. The person who has alternatives to the deal can afford to negotiate. The entire game is about making yourself less dependent on any single outcome while making others more dependent on you. Silence and restraint function as leverage in ways that most people discover too late. When you don't fill every pause with speech, you force others to reveal more than they intended. When you don't rush to respond to provocations, you make the provocateur wonder if they matter enough to provoke you. When you don't immediately accept or reject proposals, you create space where others begin negotiating against themselves, imagining your objections, and offering concessions you never demanded. This only works if you're comfortable with ambiguity, comfortable with tension, comfortable with the possibility that the other party might walk away. That comfort is the entire source of the power. Control of time is control of power because time is the resource that cannot be replaced. When you're rushing, you're spending your most finite resource recklessly. When you're patient, you're forcing others to spend theirs while yours compounds. Every day you can wait is a day your position potentially strengthens, your alternatives potentially expand, your information potentially grows. Every day your opponent waits might be a day their urgency increases, their resources deplete, their coalition fractures. This is why powerful people move slowly. Not because they're lazy, not because they don't recognize opportunities, but because they've learned that most opportunities aren't as time-sensitive as they appear, and the ones that are usually benefit the person creating the urgency rather than the person responding to it. They've learned that patience is the highest form of aggression because it imposes costs on opponents without appearing to act. They've learned that the ability to wait is often the only advantage you need because most people will eventually eliminate themselves through their own impatience. You can see it in how they carry themselves. No frantic energy, no desperate signaling, no need to prove anything in this particular moment because they're operating on timelines that extend beyond this conversation, this quarter, this year. They're building positions that will matter in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years. And while everyone else exhausts themselves chasing immediate wins and avoiding immediate losses, those positions compound silently in the background until one day the game is over and everyone realizes it ended years ago. The people who rush believe they're racing toward power. They're actually running on a treadmill someone else built, expending energy that could have been spent building leverage. Meanwhile, the powerful sit at the control panel, watching, waiting, making small adjustments to the speed and incline, letting urgency sort the players into hierarchies that were always going to emerge. They understand something most people resist accepting. That power is not seized through action alone. It's accumulated through knowing when not to act, when to let situations develop, when to allow others to exhaust themselves against problems that time will solve without intervention. That patience looks like inaction from the outside. From the inside, it's the most active form of strategy available. It's choosing every day not to be moved by forces that move everyone else. It's building slowly while others build quickly and watching their structures collapse under their own weight. It's letting time become your ally instead of your enemy. And once you understand that dynamic, once you genuinely internalize that urgency is almost always working against you, everything about power becomes clearer. The question is never whether you should rush. The question is whether you've built a position strong enough that you'll never have to.